So composition is probably one of the most frustrating things I've ever tried to teach. So what we're trying to do is we're saying we have two functions. So we have f of x equals, let's say, x squared, and g of x equals x plus 3. And I want them to find f of g of x. And what I've found in my experience is what kids do is they take whatever f is and they write that down, and then because these are right next to each other, they're going to write down x plus 3. If I'm lucky, there's a bubble. Otherwise, sometimes it's just this times x plus 3 like this. And they don't get the idea that we're replacing the x with a whole nother function. And so that's where I found using manipulatives really helps me. And I really like to use Algeblocks. So if you're not familiar, Algeblocks are these little blocks. So it's like taking base 10 blocks, only moving it to the world of algebra. And so, you know, my kids have seen this since like 6th grade. We start introducing them when we start talking about adding and subtracting positives and negatives. And so they've gone through their junior high years, they've gone through Algebra 1 using these, and so they have learned that this yellow stick is an x value. So we don't know what it's worth, that's our x value. And it's really important that you establish these things. You can't just assume they understand them. These little green blocks, or centimeter cubes, are our units. So this would actually represent the number 2 here. Algeblocks are really cool. There's a lot of other blocks. So you have this is x squared, because if you look at it, it's a square that's x by x, so x times x is x squared. You have all kinds of other ones. We can introduce another variable. We usually call that a y. And so then that means there's all kinds of other things. We have y squared. So you have all kinds of options here. But I typically am pretty happy just sticking with my x's and my 1's. And so here's what we do. I first start by talking about how we want to replace something. So I'm not even introducing any notation yet. I'm just saying we're going to learn about replacing. And so the first thing we talk about is I ask them if they've ever seen the Indiana Jones movie, where you have that statue and you replace it with the bag of sand. And usually, it's getting worse now, but usually about half the class has seen it. And so we get up the YouTube video. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you actually stop now and watch the video. You just, on YouTube, just type in Indiana Jones statue bag of sand and it'll come up. And so what the idea is, he has a statue and he wants to replace it with a bag of sand that weighs about the same amount so that the booby trap doesn't get set off and he can steal a statue. Unfortunately for him, he didn't put down the right amount of sand in the bag, so it didn't really work. But what we're working on when we then go back to the classroom is we start identifying what's the statue and what's the bag of sand. So what I'll do is I'll tell them, take out their Algeblocks, and on the board I'll write something like x plus 2, and I'll ask them to show that on their mat. So they get out the x plus 2, or just on their table. They get out an x and they get out the 2. And then I tell them, okay, let's say that I know that x equals 3. So what's happening here is x, or x, is our bag of sand, and, or sorry, not our bag of sand, x is our statue, and I'm saying my bag of sand is worth 3. Now, here's the other thing that I've learned over the years to be very particular about, and I'll explain later too why it makes more sense. But when x equals 3, you have one hand, and I tell them all to pick which hand. One hand that's going to steal the statue, and the other hand that's going to replace it with the bag of sand. And I said you can't skip this step, and you can't switch hands. Okay, so you can't go like this and then take this hand and put it there. No, I want it to actually be take the bag of sand away and then with the other hand replace it with the 3. Okay, and then and we could just keep on doing this. So now I ask them, you know, what do you have? You have 5. And at this point, they're not writing anything down. They're just working with the blocks. This is a really important step, that they understand physically what's happening and what I'm trying to really get across. And I keep doing it over and over again until I see them understanding that this is going away and this is being replaced. So I keep doing that with different numbers. I might also say, let's go with 2x. So then we have 2 x's here. And I say, well, x is worth 3. And so now they need to understand that when they replace an x with 3, they need to also replace the other x with 3. So now I have 2 groups of 3, and that's what 2x means. You have 2 groups of x, so now you have 2 groups of 3. So then we start moving on, and I say, okay, go ahead and get me x plus 2 again. So we'll set that up. Excuse the cord. Okay, x plus 2 again. And this time, and this is kind of weird mathematically, I understand, but this time I'm going to replace x with x plus 1. Now this is where my rule about which hand you're using and how you're doing it matters, because what I see a lot of kids doing is they try to cheat, and I make a big deal out of this. They see an x and they're going to say x plus 1, so they say, well, I already have an x, so I'm just going to put that there. But that's not replacing anything. We're really trying to get them to understand that they're replacing. So if you see here, I have this substitute. This is my substitute. This is my bag of sand. So I'm going to take away the statue and replace it with my bag of sand. And so then we do that again. You know, I'll just keep on giving them other examples. So we take it away and replace it with the bag of sand. And then of course it's always a good idea to add in other x values. So if I have 3x plus 2, every time I have an x, I have to replace it with x plus 1. So we're getting set up here. I'm getting out my substitutes here. And so here I go. I take away 1, I replace it. I take away 1, I replace it. I take away 1, I replace it. And it's really important to be walking around and making sure that you're doing that exact same thing. Because what we don't want is you don't want them doing this. We have 3x, and now I'm just going to put 1 on each end, because that is not replacing anything. The point isn't that they get to the right answer. The point is that they understand they're replacing. They're taking away the x here and they're replacing. Now, just a little history. When I was first teaching this, you know, my first, 8 years of teaching composition took me 3 whole days of very intense instruction and tutoring and all that. And now I find I can get it done in 1 day easily, and kids really actually understand what they're doing. So once we've done this enough, and sometimes I've made the mistake of not doing this long enough. Sometimes it takes more than 1 day. It depends on your kids. Once we've done this enough, then what we do is we start talking about, well, what does it look like on paper? So I say, okay, I have 3x plus 2. I am going to replace the x. So if this is f of x and this is g of x, when I say f of g of x, what I'm doing is I'm taking this outside function. This is saying f of x. The big picture here is f of x. I'm taking that. So I'm taking this right here. I'm going to write it down, but I'm going to get rid of the statue. And remember, what's our statue? We've talked about it for all these times that we've done this. We keep on talking about statue. What's the statue? Our statue is the x. So I'm going to write it down without the statue. And since I can't, show an outline of a statue here, I'm just going to put parentheses to leave that void there. So there's your first thing. I call it hollowing it out. Hollow out the function. So I'm writing it without the x. I put parentheses. I put it big enough to fit something else there. Then we look and we say, well, here was where the x was. Now, if I look at it here, this is where the x is. This is what my bag of sand is. G of x is my bag of sand. So I go up to g of x, and g of x is x plus 1. So I'm going to put x plus 1 in for my bag of sand. And again, this is going to take some time to really get used to it. And a really good idea is to actually have them do the Algeblocks with the writing. So, before we would have had just the 3x plus 2. And then we say, look, I'm going to replace it with x plus 1. Replace it with x plus 1. Replace it with x plus 1. And so if we look at this, and I want to analyze this compared to this, this says 3 groups of x plus 1. I have 1, 2, 3 groups of x plus 1, and then I have plus 2. So now when I simplify this, I'm going to say, well, I have what? I have 1, 2, 3 x's. Look at those. I've got 3 x's. Plus, I have 3 units. 1, 2, 3 units. Plus, I have 2 units. And so now as I keep simplifying it, hey, I can put all my units together. So I still have 3 x's, and I have 5 units. Now, if I talk about Algeblocks, I love these things. This is also one of those things, if you're in the junior high, a lot of kids will take this and say this is 8x because, you have a 3 and a 5 and you add those together and you get 8, and there was an x there, so I'm going to put it there. But now we can talk about, well, this is different than these, so I can't really put them together, so I just use my plus symbol to say that I have 3 x's and I have 5 units. And so this is just a process. It takes a while. You have to kind of gear it towards your students. Do they need more? Are they done and they can move on? That kind of thing. And of course, then we're in Algebra 2. So when you have things like f of x equals x squared plus 7 and g of x equals x to the negative 1, all of a sudden now you've got a pretty complicated problem. But if they can at least understand that this is the statue, so I hollow it out, and this is the bag of sand, now at least you can set up the problem, and then it's just a matter of them knowing their rules for exponents and just simplification in the algebra world. So this is how I teach composition using Algeblocks. You do not have to have these. You know, if you can't get your school to buy them, you don't have to have these. I have taught this kind of stuff using envelopes and Cheerios. I mean, it's really just whatever you have. Or little boxes of, you know, if you have, you know, little nerd boxes, or, you know, after Halloween, you know, take all those little boxes of all those little candies and make up boxes, paint them or whatever. You have boxes for your X's, and then you have whatever you want, beans, Cheerios, whatever you want for the units. You can do this kind of thing without having to spend really any money. So here's composition. Good luck.